It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. From Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen.
Welcome to Epigraphs. I'm Ted.
And I'm Maria.
So today we're gonna. I think this is gonna be a little bit more like a debate because I have an idea that you have some pushback on, and hopefully we'll come to a.
We always do.
Well, sure. Well, yeah. Okay. Maybe it's less of a let's collectively look at this book. It's more like I think something and you disagree at least on some level, and any rate, and hopefully it'll be a lot richer. My understanding of it will be richer and of a higher resolution by the end of this. So I'll lay out my argument and we'll go from there. So this is related to sort of my anthropology, the way that I think about being people, and I think a good way to start to get at this is thinking about the changes in the way that people structure their lives in the last 100 years, particularly related to things like marriage and family building. And it's no surprise that, or should be no surprise to anyone, that at least in the West, marriages have declined precipitously, particularly after World War II. Divorce rates are really high, and there's not anything like the, say, staying power of the nuclear family, and that there was before that. And I think a major, my contention is that a major contributing factor to that is, let's say, a failure to teach children that the skills and the goals necessary to result in people living those kinds of lives. So basically that it is not an instinctive quality of people to pursue that kind of life, but it's something that must be instructed. It must be taught, and there's also skills involved in being able to do that also are not instinctive. So that's my starting place. Is there any, and so that has to do with, I'll go ahead and bring this in right now. There's a thinker from the 20th century called Eugene Rosenstock Hesse, which I read many years ago, and a particular thing that stuck in my head from his writing is when he talks about the ways that we conceive of ourselves as an I versus a thou. He makes this, what I thought, very interesting contention that we first come to know ourselves as a thou. So that, or at least let's say that's the natural human, the normal human pattern, where you're being told by your parent or your sibling, you are so-and-so, you are my son, you are my sister, whatever, do this, do that, come here, let me give you a kiss, here's your dinner. And so our pronoun, like when we think of ourselves, it's first through a second person pronoun and not a first person pronoun. And so I see that as the first point is connecting more broadly, which is the profundity to which we receive things through other people rather than them being self-determined or let's say instinctive. So what do you think about that? What's the nuance that's missing, or is it fundamentally wrong?
Well, that is I would say it's a more moderate view than you laid out to me earlier in the kitchen.
Good. Well,
but I think that it oversimplifies the way in which we learn things, as if we can only learn things from other people. And many times the easiest way to learn things from is from other people. But the things that you're describing, we agree. I'm guessing most of the people who end up listening to this podcast will agree that people flourish in the kinds of relationships that you're talking about that are on the decline.
Mm-hmm.
Like stable families.
Mm-hmm.
And when we don't have those kinds of relationships, then people don't flourish.
Yes.
And your parents can teach you that that's the kind of thing you should be aiming for and teach you how to get there. But if they don't, then what you run up against is the fundamental need of human civilization to have those kinds of things in place. And you end up having to relearn that.
Yeah, and I've seen that in my, well, you say a civilizational need, and I definitely agree with that. Even on, I think there's a personal need too. If you get halfway there, I mean, you can see that you want to get there, and you might not know how. And so,
Well, I say civilizational because, particularly things like marriage, a civilization requires stable marriages, but not everyone has to be married.
right, yes, absolutely, I agree with that. There's actually a fascinating piece that I listened to last year around Easter, talking about sort of presenting stable marriage as being the let's say the most basic binding force of society, in opposed to Girard's idea of it being sacrifice, which is interesting. And then they talk about the passion story as being both a sacrifice and having deep parallels to a marriage, which is very interesting. We could talk about that another time. But I agree, and it might be interesting to think about maybe why that is so important on a societal and on a civilization level. But sorry, I was going to say that I sort of see people halfway there, where they are the children of broken families of divorced parents, and they're still aiming at that sort of stable family life, but they don't have this. They don't really know how, and so that one's interesting to me because they have the goal in mind, they have the desire to do it, but they weren't like taught like the relational skills. They didn't see those relational skills, and I want to say I'm using taught here in a very broad sense, right? Not your parents sat you down and said, "Here's our six lesson course on how to argue with each other," right? Because you.
Okay.
Well, and it's interesting. So you and I talked about that academy, the Acton Academy that I'd come across, and I was reading the description of it, and it was like, we put all these kids together, and like it's very loose and unstructured, and like there's a lot of like self-teaching and negotiation between the two students, and I was like, well, hold on, you said the exact same thing. Oh, this sounds like a big family. And the degree to which when you're in a big family, you have lots of siblings, you are those relational negotiation skills are something that, unless your family's falling apart, are something that you just they come out. Do you think that do you think there should be a different term for that versus sort of the more like didactic teaching, right? Because it's one thing for your parents to teach you mathematics or to learn arithmetic or to learn to read. It's another thing to learn from your siblings or your parents. When someone takes something that you want, how do I respond? And that might not be something that you're ever no one like writes out, and rarely do you have something like written out as an algorithm of like, this is how you go through the various steps of that process. Do you think those are different? I mean, I also know you've done a lot, have more knowledge, like the theory of education and stuff. Would you consider those to be different kinds of teaching?
They're different kinds of teaching. They're not necessarily different kinds of learning.
Okay.
Because when you learn something like math, you don't actually learn it because somebody told it to you. They told you how to do it, and then you did it, and that's how you learned it. You didn't learn it by... Like, you have to actually...
Oh, great. Yeah,
even if it's just a fact that you're learning, you have to actually rethink that fact in your own mind.
Yeah, okay. I love... Well, right, so now we're doing this, we're having this conversation, right? And one of the main reasons I wanted to do it was because of how much I learned from doing the conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So I have these ideas spinning around in my head when I'm working or reading or listening to a podcast or something, and then I come to you and I realize how I can't do that idea in a conversation. Yeah. It's like, well, hold on, that sounded really great, but do I really know it? No, I don't. Let's work through it. So you would say that, can I make it even more stark and say that fundamentally all learning is doing?
Yeah, if we're talking about a really fundamental level, then I would agree with that.
That's really interesting. Okay, do you think
it's not my idea?
No, I believe that.
It came from, well, I don't know where he got it. I read it in Milton Gregory. He wrote the 7 Laws of Teaching.
Okay.
It's a classical school classic.
Great. That is really interesting. Well, so maybe that feels like it's going to probably help maybe start to work at this a little bit more. So what you're talking about gives people an early
controlled, safe, to use a trigger word, environment in which to do those things. And
Right.
if they miss that early environment, then they end up having to, well, they either don't learn them, or they learn them by doing in harder circumstances.
Right, because that would be one of the biggest things that I would say is that about this sort of set of things to learn is that they are all deeply consequential later on in life. Mm-hmm. Like the way that you learn them have profound consequences on you.
If you take somebody else's money later,
yes,
it has far greater consequences than if you took a coin out of your sister's piggy bank when you were 3.
So it's interesting, and I don't want to. I mean, I think that this is right. Like, I think that stuff is deeply learned from the people around you, most especially at an early age. Doesn't Chesterton say something like, by the time a child goes to school at the age of 4, he's already learned everything important there is to learn?
I don't know. I haven't heard that before.
It's something like that, and I've also heard. I think Jordan Peterson talks about there's somewhere at the age of 2, and then again at the age of 4. There's some this massive socialization change where children stop basically being concerned only with themselves, mm-hmm. and they're basically acting like sociopaths until they're 2, and then they learn how to be a person around other people, which that whole phrase is really interesting. But the thing that I don't want to get, because I hear in myself immediately this sort of social construct, like everything is it's all
nurture and no nature.
It's all nurture and no nature, and I know that that's not right. At least some, I don't want to get into that too much right now, but for a high level, maybe we'll have to, but for a high level look at that, do you think it's something like what C.S. Lewis is talking about in The Abolition of Man, where he's discussing general morality? So for instance, people have these general, unless you're really broken, there's a general understanding of killing is bad in the wrong circumstances, and then there could be all sorts of learning.
Murder is bad.
Murder is bad, and it's what kind of killing is murder?
That, yeah.
Yeah. So, do you think that might relationships? Well, how can I? Reciprocity is good, but who do you show reciprocity to, and under what circumstances, and how much? Do you think it's that kind of learning that's going on there in that sort of acculturation, socialization with children?
You're saying, so you have an innate knowledge that reciprocity is good, and then what you learn is
how that's embedded, what the circumstances, how you, or is it even more just we have some innate knowledge of that things are good, and we don't know, say moral. There are certain things that are moral, and we are learning how to do it. Do you think it's yes, these things are good, we're learning how to do it, or do we or are we even just being taught at the most basic level, don't hit people, hurting other people is unnecessarily is a bad thing? I mean, again, you say I say unnecessarily,
it's hard to say because it is. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that it's so dependent on development. You don't expect a 2-year-old to recognize that hitting somebody else is intrinsically bad.
Right.
And so people tell them that.
Yes.
And at that level, basically everybody gets told that. So I don't know what happens if you get a 12-year-old who's never been told that. If the 12-year-old ought to instinctively learn that, it's almost impossible to know, because in order to hit somebody, you had to be around people, and other people are going to tell you.
They're going to tell you right away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting too, and it's and you're well, I'd be curious to know, and I'm but I don't want to find out.
I don't want
to find out. Yeah, I mean, frankly, people are dangerous. Which is interesting. There's this sense of, I love that. In subsequent readings, I've really loved that line when in the Two Towers, when, spoiler alert, Gandalf comes back, and Gimli says, what does he say? He says, someone told us you were, you told us that Treebeard is dangerous, Fanghorn is dangerous, and Gandalf says, of course he's dangerous, right? I am dangerous. Aragorn is dangerous. You yourself are dangerous, Gimli. You're beset by dangers, and there's this sense in which when you're, I mean, and this is actually really getting to a lot of the heart of what I want to get at. Whether it's my children as my biological children, or they're your nieces and nephews, right? Mm-hmm. Or it's your grandchildren. All these people who are participating in the rearing of children. There's a peril in it. Mm-hmm. Right, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is the sense that well, now this sounds very, you can't if you just take someone and say, yeah, everything's going to turn out fine, like you're a person, all of this is innate, you can end up with something that's profound, really, really dangerous. Like the kinds of people that come out of those circumstances are really dangerous. So what I find really compelling about that idea, which is a funny thing to find compelling, is that I think it paints the common activities of human life as not being the sort of thing that's just necessarily going to turn out in one direction. This is what I was trying to get at earlier when we were talking before we started recording. That I'm trying to get at a way of looking at the basic activities of human life as something other than having a guaranteed outcome. That's what I'm trying to say. That there's not a guaranteed outcome in the way that people are going to turn out, which means that, say the things that we do as the sort of basic human things are actually properly viewed as let's say, a perilous adventure, rather than this like stick in the mud. We already know how this is going to happen. You flip a coin, it's either heads or tails. No one's like holding their breath.
Here's where I would push back against that.
Okay.
Or maybe exaggerate it. I don't know. You say perilous adventure. I say so perilous that if you get them wrong, then that line of human existence basically disappears.
Yes.
Within a couple generations.
Yes.
So one of the things you said earlier was that people talk about governments rising and falling and ideas rising and falling and people just basically being people, and so they
you can count on them being there.
Yeah. But if you think about the things that have disappeared the fastest, they tend to be the ones that are counter to people being people. So like the communist governments.
That's the first thing I thought of.
And utopian communities that pretend that humans don't need this kind of basic family structure, they don't last.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, like the utopian thing is basic family structure because people are good. On the communist side, it's basic family structure because the state can replace it. They're sort of like opposite ends of that. I mean, that's actually really interesting that you brought that up. I've been pondering recently, that so you have the Soviet government that for 50 years, 60 years, they're just like grinding down on the people under them. And I was thinking about this because of Dostoevsky. And so a major part of it is the Russian Orthodox Church in the Brothers Karamazov, right? There's the monastery and there's the monks and the priests. Mm-hmm. And Russian society there, according to what I'm reading about rural Russian society in Dostoevsky, seems like just unbelievably different from modern Russian society. And so it's not like the Soviet Union didn't leave an indelible mark on Russia. On the other hand, there was the Russian Orthodox Church and the Soviet Union. And now the Soviet Union's gone and the Russian Orthodox Church is still there. Mm-hmm. And I find that fascinating. I also read this book a few months ago called A Canticle for Leibowitz, and it's a science fiction book about this Catholic monastery 600 years and then on after a nuclear holocaust. And his idea is like the things that make it through, a total nuclear war is like the Roman Catholic Church. And it sounds funny, but then you think, well, why would it be that and like villages that make it through the Holocaust when nothing else does?
This is related to something that I have thought about when reading fiction that was actually written during World War I and World War II in particular, and contrasting it with things like, I love Victorian novels. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But there's a real difference in focus, particularly when it comes to institutions and families. And in the Victorian period, I'm particularly thinking of Anthony Trollope. He's got these institutions. Yeah. They're very much there. There's the Church of England. There's Parliament. There are all these, they are players in his world, but it's not really what he's so focused on. And there's no sense of crisis insofar as the institutions are concerned. It's all sort of focused on the events of these people's lives. Mm-hmm. when you read what people were writing, and these are very like domestic novels from World War One through World War Two, there's a much stronger embrace of the institutions because that's what needs to come through. That's what's going to carry them through the huge crises.
Interesting. Do you so do you think that's in relation to sort of the stuff we were talking about earlier, and then the comments I made about the Soviet Union and A Canticle for Leibowitz, which obviously is fictional, but plausibly fictional, I'll put it that way in my mind. Do you see that as like the right? Do you see that as the right focus to have? And when you say institutions, I'm understanding you to say institutions, say above the level of the institution of a household.
Right. And, but institutions pretty broadly. So it might be a community, like a village.
A village or a university.
Or, a university, even a government.
Yeah. Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, in the world wars, that was, I think that's what felt like it was at stake, was like nations.
Yeah. And so those broader identities become, I think, extra important when they're threatened, especially by something that is on that same kind of scale. When it's no longer, you can't view World War II as a personal crisis.
That's so do you think that there's a direct link, a causal link from that to what I started out hypothesizing, which is let's say the failure to acknowledge that level of humanization at the family level in the post-war period? Because there's two ways that I could see that happening. One way is that you've gone through what you're talking about, where like everyone's kind of realized, hey, we've got to fight for the nation, otherwise we're all going to be gone. And so you come to put your trust in the institutions and are thinking about it on that level. The other one is, I could also look at the post-war, the way that I've typically looked at it is post-war prosperity. We're at that, sort of this flowering of industrialism in the West in, say from the 1950s to the 1980s. And there's this unprecedented increase in prosperity and stability. And yes, you got the Cold War, but like, the hippie, and then you have the hippie movement and all of that stuff. I've always thought it of, wow, things feel so good. There's just this assumption that we can just let things keep running. That's kind of been my assumption. And so it's like, right, like things are great. The kids are in school, like they'll figure it out. Like we figured it out, they'll figure it out. It'll be fine. There'll always be food on the table and, a nice neighborhood to grow up in. Mm-hmm. That's the way that I've looked at it. What you're saying is an interesting either challenge or nuance or balance to it, which is saying maybe the events of the first half of the 20th century were in some ways so jarring that they kind of pulled people's gaze upward to this institutional level, to the degree that they became blind to the need for that same level of, let's say, of heroic action or of intentional duty at the much smaller scale of the family, of those sort of personal relationships. What do you think about that?
I haven't thought about that for sure. It's just hard to know what kind of scale to think of these things on, because the 50s were, if anything, like even more rigid when it came to things like, being part of a community and very stringent gender roles for a lot of families. To the extent that I think people often fall into the trap now of thinking that complementarianism necessarily looks like a 1950s housewife and her husband who's gone all day
to the office. Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know if you can look at the 1950s and say, well, that was just an aftermath of people embracing these sources of stability, or say that was a further development and then something changed again in the 60s.
Yeah. I mean, I'll
using these decades
very
somewhat loosely.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there has been I do keep coming. I have things that keep going back to the 60s, which is really interesting. there's just like a time in my history that I didn't really like put much weight on, and yeah, a lot happened in that decade in our country, which is, I mean, that's a whole nother, there's a lot to it there, but yeah, it's hard to do forensics for me because I kind of think about, well, why do people, let's say, neglect that work, because it really is work, whether it's joyful or not, like it's a real work to do those things. Why do people neglect that now?
What things?
The socialization of children. Let's say stable families, socialization of children. It doesn't have to just be in the nuclear family, but in the family, the familial socialization of children, and that is in sort of leave people to develop as they choose. And I'm just realizing it's a weird thing, because when I start thinking about it, I can immediately think of about 5 very plausible explanations for that, and they're not connected really. And so it's strange to me that I can think of all these things at the same time in history that all seem to converge on it. And well, I mean, for one thing, that makes me think that maybe I don't understand it. On the other hand, it makes me think maybe it's actually extraordinarily important if you have all these converging lines. But because I can think of things like, well, the rise of public school and the idea that the government is going to do that, and sort of the rise of expertism, right? So who should raise my children? Well, the expert should, I should, someone who knows how to teach should teach my children. There's that kind of thing. There's that, I find also very plausible, the sort of stability and abundance that our society was experiencing for the first time, that can lead you to for one thing, it can lead you to think, well, things are going to just turn out fine and our kids are going to turn out fine. And on the other hand, it can, I think, just lead you to a place of not, that not being forced on you. I mean, because the reality is that, when things are hard, you end up being thrown into tighter relationships with the people around you, or they disintegrate. And so when things are really easy, it's a lot easier to have, when things are easy and safe, it's a lot easier to have loose ties with the people around you rather than close ties. So that's another one. Then you have sort of, I can also see the rise of the individualized self, where people actually think, this is the one that I see them, I think, most strongly, most recently, this idea that it's actually some sort of, you're wronging your child by doing that to them, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you have any insight into how early that was coming about. I mean, that feels like, the sort of absurdist flowering of that is, I'm not going to tell my child that he's a boy, right? Mm-hmm. Like, he needs to determine that for himself. I'm like, if you can't tell your child that he's a boy, you probably don't feel like you should quash his desire to, do X, Y, or Z for some, higher purpose of having him be let's say a socialized child. It's like, so I don't know. What do you think about the fact that I can sit here and come up with, to me at least, 4 plausible causes for that pattern, and none of them seem to be like, I don't see any immediate like common root to all of them.
Well, I think history is complicated.
Agreed.
And people are complicated.
Also agreed.
And culture is complicated. I think that anytime... It's just me pontificating.
Go for it.
Anytime that you have something that destabilizes to that extent, you do have to look for a source of stability somewhere else. And that's why people embrace their institutions in crises, because they need stability from somewhere.
Oh,
and so,
yeah, okay.
So if you have a stable society in some ways, well, in lots of ways, and that allows you to sort of destabilize some of them without everything immediately falling apart.
Yes, yeah.
And so,
okay.
And then it lets you depending on what it is, that's going to have a greater or a lesser effect. And so what I think is things like, we see this with marriage in particular, that we have such an extraordinarily long history of stable marriage in the West that we have been able to cut out the foundations of it and then the institution itself has gradually eroded. And
cut flower culture, which is such a great phrase.
I haven't heard it before, but yes. And so as that, but the stability of the original foundation let the institution itself get so well built up and stable that you can continue on. You've got that momentum built up to last for however long.
Yeah.
Before you start to really see the effects of that, which is a two-edged sword. It means there's time to recover, but it also means that you don't necessarily see the bad consequences
it's
if
really,
you're not really taking the long view.
It's really damaging if you have a short-term consequentialist view of those things. So there was maybe 2 years ago, I listened to a podcast with Jordan Peterson and this guy who was he was a psychologist, and he worked in I think he worked in a prison and a hospital in London. And so he's seeing London street people, really troubled London street people. That's who he was working with. And the conversation ended up mostly being about the institution of marriage and serial monogamy, adultery, whatever you want to call it. And the line that they were tracing was essentially that the people who started presenting this idea of you can have these non-married serially monogamous relationships were all the people who were presenting that as an option coming out of a society almost dominated by marriage in regards to the union between a man and a woman, that they were all the children of rich, very well educated, stable people. And so you can go off and do that and have a partner, big quotes, for 2 years, then go off to someone else and someone else. And especially when you're young and when you have a stable family behind you and around you, that works. He said, but you
have that existing source of stability that lets you incorporate chaos.
Yes.
Or destabilize.
Exactly.
Another part of your life without immediately seeing disaster.
But then when you take that idea and you bring it down to the people who are living very marginal lives down at the bottom of society, then the result is just hellish, and you have domestic violence, tons of really unhealthy single parent households, the men, abusive relationships, and on and on and on and on. And it's really terrible because they don't have that stable, and especially once you've gone through 3 generations of that, it's okay, this really isn't good. And so that's part of what's so interesting to me about all this is that now we are in this place where, there are fewer and fewer people who have come out of that sort of familial stability. And there is at least, so what you were saying, basically, when you first start out, it's hey, man, this is going pretty well. This seems to be working out. But the further you get down the road, those cracks start showing up. And those cracks are everywhere now, whether or not we're willing to see that that's the cause. And again, so a lot of my peers, in college when they're getting married, so many of them are out of divorced households, and they're that didn't work out, for various reasons. They recognize, hey, that's not the way I want to conduct my life. And so there's this sort of looking sideways, right? Looking back and looking sideways and saying, how can we, we're a little on the late side, but how can we pick this up? And so it's really interesting to me to see how much of that is innate, and how much of that you could just as a couple say, hey, we've got this goal. We've decided this is the goal. Let's try to do this. And how much of it has to be looking sideways and saying, who are the people that still remember how to do this? Who are the people that are living that out?
And it's going to be some of both.
Yeah. I just, it's, I guess I keep coming back to this, the sort of, the fact that this stuff isn't a given. It's this division of looking at a stable society, a society to the degree that it's stable and healthy is not one because of something like stagnation or unoriginality or even really rigidity in the proper sense. I think overly rigid societies also fall apart. And you're
that may be what happened from the 50s to the 60s.
Absolutely. And so what is it that gives life to a society is actually this continual process of working these things out over and over and over on these individual levels for this child, for this couple, and so because
Well, that's one of the things that's so valuable about the family as well. You said working things out over and over and over. Is that the family is basically, it's our longest term relationship.
yes,
Often.
right,
Now, friendship can be, but that's certainly the exception rather than the rule. And so if you're in a stable family, it provides that time that you need besides all the other advantages.
yeah. Well, and then you also have Chesterton's interesting point about the family, which is that when you with your friend you choose your friends, and so you can choose people who are just like you, but like your family is given to you.
Well, you choose your spouse.
You choose your
these
spouse.
Days.
With the except right. Anyway, that's another conversation. But that when you're thinking about your parents, your siblings, your children, right? Those are just here they are. Yes, genetic similarities, but like you can't pick them, and so the degree of the necessity for learning how to negotiate those things, it's like if you can figure that out, you can definitely figure out friendship. That's the way that I think about it. It's like because it's a lot like a sonnet. I mean, maybe I'd be curious to know what you think of this. Do you think that part of the reason that people have been so fascinated with highly structured poetry is because of the way that it connects to the way that it sort of mirrors this process of figuring out how to make it work with the most rigid structures that we've been given, like family? Because there's some, do you see what I'm saying? Like we're fascinated by I'm fascinated by the fact that
I don't really think that.
Okay,
but I do think that they are both related to the human ability to flourish within certain constraints.
Yes. Okay. Sure. I'll buy that.
But I don't think it's about mirroring.
No, they're both. Well, they're both. Yes. In one case, i.e., negotiating your life in a family, that's sort of like I have to do this, and then with a sonnet, there's like a delight in it. It's sort of like the same process, but instead of being like, it's really important that I get this sonnet written. It's more of this delight in, wow, I can't believe they managed, Shakespeare managed to say so many different things in so many different ways with the exact same metrical structure.
Well, I think it was Keats who, his writing warm-up was to just write a sonnet.
Oh,
so
my
some
goodness.
people do have to
Oh my goodness.
just get their sonnet written. But
oh my goodness. Yeah, but too, that again, that's a fascinating, I got to think about that. It's like, how am I going to write? And I mean, I'll be perfectly frank. I don't know how Keats typically wrote. Was it in open?
He wrote no.
Okay.
He's a romantic.
Okay.
Unless you mean blank verse.
Blank verse. Yeah.
He
like
wrote
Milton.
some blank verse. He also wrote sonnets and he wrote odes and.
Okay, but like his way of getting in it was not like stream of consciousness or just writing, or writing a whole bunch of like free verse or blank verse or
Well,
anything
I don't
like
know
that.
how he actually developed the sonnet. I think that was just the first thing he did.
But he wrote a sonnet. That's really. At any rate, so there's this, but there is. I mean, that's sort of like a whole. Well, okay, maybe here. This would be something to think about. Is all human activity actually of that kind, of negotiating an appropriate outcome within a recognized framework? Do you think that's the right way?
Yeah, because we live in the world.
Okay, I'm trying to look at this in an appropriate way where it's like I'm giving it enough distinction where it's still meaningful. I don't want to blow this up where it's like, well, it's everything, because it's not everything. I don't think.
Well, there are areas of life where we have more constraints than others.
Do you think that the difference becomes when we see the constraints as more important than the degrees of freedom? Do you think? I mean, because like when I sit down at a page, like if I had like a blank piece of paper and a pen and I'm gonna like doodle, I don't. My thought does not go to the constraints of this task. It's much more the space of possibility. Whereas like I'm thinking about a sonnet, I would immediately be faced with the constraints of that. Does that distinction does that difference make sense to you?
I'm not sure what line you're trying to draw.
I'm trying to draw. Well, okay, the line that I'm trying to draw is that there are some activities where I feel very aware of the constraints. So, for instance, writing a sonnet or being married. right? It's like being married. It's like, this is my wife.
Mm-hmm.
I'm married to her. Like, that constraint is always there. You know, it's never, I'll get a different wife.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there's plenty of other things where, like, I'm going to go on a walk. I don't think, wow, you mean I have to go at, you know, somewhere between, you know, 2 and 4 miles per hour, and I have to do it by setting one foot in front of the other, and, like, I can't walk, you know, I can't step in the water. You know,
Well, I think it's just a spectrum.
Right.
There are other things like going to college. You have all kinds of choices whether you go to college or not, what you're going to major in there, what specific courses you're going to take. But as you narrow those things down, you have certain constraints that are necessarily there. You know, if you decide to go to college, then you still have the choice of what college you're going to go to,
Yeah.
but there's all sorts of, you know, all sorts of possibilities that you have eliminated just by deciding that you're going to go to college.
You're going to go and do that thing, yeah.
Down to once you've, you know, started attending particular classes, the professor has set the course requirements, and in order to do well in that class, you're going to have to write a certain number of papers and take a certain number of tests, etc., etc.
Do you think that? Okay, so I mean, I think it shouldn't be difficult for anyone to see that that is distasteful to the society writ large right now. The idea of, well, let's say unnecessary constraint, which should be unnecessary constraint, particularly non-voluntary unnecessary constraint, should be distasteful. But that the that the realm of unnecessary has been, like, extended to almost everything.
That's what I hear.
Yes. Do you think that, because when we went from thinking about negotiating family relationships, which there is certainly, like, plenty of pain to be found there, especially when you're not behaving yourself well, though it could be other people too. There's certainly some pain to be found there. But when I think about, you brought up the university, going to college, and I think about the anxiety that so many freshmen face of, like, what am I going to major in?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's a causal relationship there between this push towards eliminating to moving as far in the unconstrained direction as possible, and a fundamental anxiety by unconstrained choice in people's lives? Because
because the more choices you had to make, then the more choice anxiety you're going to have, just by definition.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's one of those things where it's, you know, you've got to be living in the right in the sort of the Goldilocks zone.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never, it's good for me to remember that. And so then, you know, and then I think, well, how do you determine where that Goldilocks zone is? And it's like, well, what, you know, to go back, sort of like, what have we been taught to know that that's the right space? It's like, well, you know, maybe your work for a while is something that, you know, is to some degree mutable, right? What about your relationships? Well, your friends, that's, you know, you should be choosing your friends. Like, that's good. It's good to choose your friends. You can't really choose your family to some degree. You could do a little bit, but, like, you know, and
there are other factors too, though, when you think about choice anxiety. There's some other term for it, like decision fatigue and that kind of thing. You know, there's also people have studied this. I don't know what they said.
I think decision fatigue is like a short term thing. That's where you wear someone down and then ask them, hey, do you want to spend $100 on this protection plan for your $80 phone? And you're like, yeah, I guess I'll say yes.
But that, you know, that's not just because we have all these extra decisions to make, although that I think certainly is part of it. But there are other things like not having a clear picture of what your actual factors are in your decision. So you ask freshmen to decide what they're going to study, and they don't know why they would choose any particular course of study. That's going to make it really hard for them to decide.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so, and then you get into the whole,
you know, what's the goal of their education? What are they going to do afterwards?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. I mean,
how does what they're studying relate to that?
And you have and then you have the problem of you have no idea what that's going to be like. Like, you can't be inside having been done with med school and being a doctor.
Yes.
Until you've done that. And then there you are. And so there's a lot of this sort of as long as it's within the realm of proper action, just act.
Yes.
Which is, should take a lot of weight off of our shoulders. And again, that's a great point, because that's what I'm trying to get at again, which is to say that, let's say and we could argue about what this means, but I think you've got a pretty similar idea. The common realm of human activity, to be there, like, means you're on the right path in some sense. Are you doing the things that people do? The kind of things that people do. Are you doing it well? Great. You probably shouldn't be worried if you made the wrong decision. As long as you're, like, engaged in those things. Does that, I mean,
yeah, well,
are you busying yourself with being a human, essentially?
That gets all the way back most fundamentally to what is your conception of human flourishing and what a human ought to do.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
if your idea of human flourishing is that you're going to end up in this perfect career, then it is so vital and hard to make the decisions along the way, because you don't know how you're going to get there. But if your picture of human flourishing is to be in good relationships with the people around you and in right relationship with God,
Mm-hmm.
then that doesn't really have anything to do with what major you chose.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite, let's see, agnostic to your situation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pattern that can be instantiated in countless ways. I mean, look at the world. It's like, great. Okay. What kind of degree of economic prosperity is necessary for that? It's like, well, a lot. People have managed with a lot of different things. It's like some are more helpful than others, but where do you need to be living? Do you need to be living in a city or out in the country? And on and on and on and on. And yeah, this is part of the process that I've been going through for the last, like, 3.5, 4 years. I got inculcated. I don't know where. I mean, specifically where. I'll put it that way. Sorry, I just watched a movie where there's just, like, incredibly, like, selfish and manipulative villain. It's the Puss in Boots movie, which I actually enjoyed, where the villain's experiencing his downfall. And he goes, "What did I do to deserve this? I mean, specifically." I realized that I've been inculcated with it having things backward, in the sense of viewing the sort of common things of human life, and I mean common in the sense that they're available. They're what the people should commonly be doing, as being sort of subsidiary and justified by these larger, more, like, rarefied aspects of society, like, say, scientific learning or the artistic endeavor. And realizing that, well, first of all, that tremendously devalues the individual human soul, which I think is fundamentally antithetical to Christianity. But then it's just, like, misery making, which is kind of to your point, because then especially when you're engaged in the process of really trying to be engaged with your family and friends, those things become, at best, a stepping stone to the real business of life in the world, and at worst, something that's getting in the way of it. And I think there's can be a lot of, say, freedom from and motivation to doing those things rightly, those common things rightly, when you view it not as something that's going to happen whether I show up or not. That's kind of what I've been trying to get at. Those things, it's not, we can't just be like, people are going to turn out fine whether I show up or not. It's like, no. All of those things are dependent on people waking up every day and doing the right things and loving each other, because they love God, most fundamentally, because they're loving God rightly. And my friend Brandon says, he's like, if you want to be a good farmer, the most important thing that you can do is go to mass, which is great. He's like, if your worship to God is rightly ordered, like, the other things are going to be ordered as well. And I think that you could take that a step further, right? It's like, are you concerned most fundamentally with the union of the souls that are your soul and the souls around you with God, or are you concerned with for their own sake the things that are supposed to aid in that? That's what I'm trying to say. And I think I'm finally getting into my head. Those things are there to aid people in their pursuit of rightly loving God. It's not like we love God so that we're good people, so that we can keep society together. Like, that's the backwards way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know what you think. This has been really helpful for me. I think it's really strengthened some of the things that I've been trying to work on there. And there's a lot more in the realm of talking about givenness in general. I think I'm trying to come to a much deeper appreciation for constraint and limitedness and the limitedness of our being. And I know that's something we've touched on before, but that, I don't know. It seems like there at different times in history, there are certain aspects of truth that most fundamentally need to be emphasized as, say, the antidote to the thing that's poisoning us in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's the movie that won the Oscar Best Picture this year, which I haven't watched. It's called Everything Everywhere All at Once. And it's essentially about, from what I've read about it, it's like the outgrowth of people of our generation and the anxiety, this sort of like weird malaise and anxiety of growing up with the internet and having everything available to you all the time. And so it's this multiverse jumping story, but it's trying to put into words what happens when there is no constraint and everything's floating around everywhere all the time. And you can have everything all at once.
It oddly makes me think of the Richard Wilbur poem, Love Calls Us to the Things of This World.
Which I will tell you, I read this morning as preparation for this and didn't tell you.
But it's almost the inverse, and it's such a charming, in a lot of ways, desire to escape from things, but not by going to where everything is available, but he says, his plea is, let there be nothing on earth but laundry. And it's sort of that, it's something of that same impulse, I think, in a pre-computer world.
Yes.
of escape that's the wrong way to go.
I will say in
Wilbur's... And he says,
yes.
Love calls us to the things of this world, not because we love the things of this world, but because...
it's only in this world that we can love.
Yeah.
I would say to maybe wrest this out of Wilbur's hands. I don't know if this is an intention, but I would also, sort of to add to that, I think that our best, the best shot at finding joy and peace in this world, as far as that goes, is in that sort of same plea of let there be nothing but laundry, is to find that appropriate level of gaze and maybe, cultivate hobbit virtue, to put it in someone else's terms. And I think about the things that Thorin Oakenshield tells Bilbo at the end of The Hobbit. Right?
Yeah, but I don't want to wrest it out of Wilbur's hands, because he says let there be nothing on earth but laundry, when he is having this early morning vision of laundry as escape, basically. And what he calls us back to is laundry for a purpose.
Yes.
Let there be, clear dances done in the sight of heaven. And so laundry that you do to clothe people.
That's lovely. And speaking of clothing, I think that's a good place to close.
Oh, please.